Hello and welcome from my side too. Welcome to today's web talk, Knowledge Diplomacy in Times of Disruption and Beyond. My name is Ben Brisch, and as Director of the German Center for Research and Innovation, the DWIH New York, the DWIH New York, I'm especially pleased that today's web talk is a joint event of the American Council on Germany, the ACG, and 1014 and the DWIH. This web talk is part of the series Resilience and Adaptation that ACG and 1014 initiated. And I'm very happy that the DWIH can join this series today and that we can bring our audience, mostly coming from science and research and from business and industry. The German Center for Research and Innovation, funded by the German Foreign Office, is, as it is a member organization of more than 40 German science organizations, universities, and the German American Chambers of Commerce, is also very much, can also very much be considered a part of transatlantic knowledge diplomacy. Knowledge diplomacy is highly relevant for research and innovation, as the disruption of the pandemic requires more international cooperation than ever, and yet there are many challenges for knowledge diplomacy. What about different decisions in Europe and the United States about measures against the pandemic, for example? What about different decisions on travel restrictions that also affect the free exchange and cooperation between scientists and innovators? What about the inevitable requirement to cooperate with non-democratic countries and regimes in the fight against COVID? These are challenges that are relevant for scientists, for business, for politics, and the civil society. So we are delighted to have two much renowned experts here today to discuss these and many other questions. Dr. Esther Brimmer is the Executive Director and CEO of NAFSA, Association of International Educators, and she's also former Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. And we have Dr. Georg Schütte, Secretary General of the Volkswagen Foundation and former State Secretary at the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. So both our experts have been in high government leadership positions at earlier stages of their career, and now they are at the leadership of organizations that can be considered as part of the civil society and that are very actively promoting and supporting international academic exchange and cooperation in higher education, science, and research, as far as I know. So I'm personally very much looking forward to the discussion with them. And with this, I hand over to my colleagues from ACG and 1014. Steve.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. We are delighted to be partnering with the German Center for Research and Innovation on this project. Katja Wiesbach-Donovan and I are really happy to be continuing our joint series between 1014 and the ACG, focusing on resilience and adaptation with our two guests today. And it is wonderful to see you both, Esther and Georg. It is really delightful. In both cases, it has been far too long. So I am very happy that you are able to join us today. The COVID-19 pandemic really seems to have brought scientists and policymakers closer than ever as they've tried to grapple with the implications of the pandemic and as they've collectively tried to address the global public health challenges, both domestically and internationally. And in today's conversation, we're looking forward to exploring whether this collaboration will continue and what the role of the transfer of knowledge can play as a tool for public diplomacy. It seems to me that the nomination of Amy Gutmann, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, as the next US ambassador to Germany, is a really good case in point, because if she's confirmed, her appointment will revive a somewhat dormant but long-standing US tradition of sending scholars and university presidents to Germany as ambassadors. Before we dive in, though, I have two quick housekeeping points. The first is that ACG and 1014 are both independent, nonpartisan organizations. The views expressed during the conversation are those of our experts. And if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function or the chat function in Zoom, and Katja and I will do our best to fold your questions into the conversation. With that, let me hand it over to Katja, who will set the stage for us this morning.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Esther and Georg, for joining us this morning. You have both spent much of your careers focused on science and international knowledge transfer in academia, international organization, government, and independent organizations. And so, drawing from your experience in broad brushstrokes, what were the challenges you experienced because of the pandemic? Was there a massive disruption, or rather a renewed appreciation for scientific knowledge? Or perhaps both. So Esther, maybe we start with you. So your organization is the world's largest nonprofit association dedicated to international education and exchange. It strives to advance policies and practices that ensure a more interconnected and peaceful world. How was your work impacted by the pandemic?
Well, first, I'd like to thank our host for bringing us together for this important discussion. Indeed, it's been too long since I've seen you, Stephen. It's good to be reunited, and it's an honor to be on this panel and discussing these issues. So I look forward to our conversation and the questions that we will have and the discussion this morning. And indeed, I have the honor of leading NAFSA, the Association of International Educators. We have members in 3,500 institutions in 130 countries, and we are proud of our long tradition of cooperation with Germany in particular, as you know, from board members to our annual work with the state of Baden-Württemberg for our seminar. We know there's been deep cooperation, particularly on international education between the United States and Germany. And like so many, we applaud the nomination of a university president as ambassador, and of course, pending the will of the Senate, look forward to having an ambassador in that position who so strongly supports higher education and international education. That said, I would say that indeed for international education, that this has been an extremely challenging period. The pandemic, of course, first and foremost, has had, of course, a serious loss of life. We also realize it has impeded the ability for people to travel, whether as students or scholars. And so that we recognize that for many institutions, there was a significant personal and intellectual hit as well as an economic one. Yet, despite the impact of the pandemic, we see real innovation. And that's what I want to share with you this morning, is that we have seen on campuses efforts precisely to bring together scholars and researchers in the higher education space, working on public health, working on scientific cooperation, and there's some really good examples. So just to flag a couple, that NAFSA, as you know, supports something called the Senator Paul Simon Award for Comprehensive Internationalization. We recognize excellence in internationalization and realize that that can include important online learning. So we've seen institutions expanding their work on online learning. Take, for example, additional work between Florida International University, which was a winner this year, one of our winners this year of the Simon Award. They created a virtual reality program with English and Arabic called the Virtual Tableau between universities in the US and universities in North Africa. They worked in particular with the El-Baghi University in Algeria and Ibn Tufayl University in Morocco. They were able to bring together over 1,400 students in 12 sessions working on language acquisition. Because that's one of the challenges is if you cannot travel on language acquisition. And they're both bringing the students together and they're also studying how does the virtual space affect language acquisition. So we see really creative activities. And even I'll close by saying that even in NAFSA's own work, that we have spent the past several months converting our flagship professional development programs to completely online versions. We love doing the in-person, but we recognize that they need to be accessed online. So even here at NAFSA, those programs are now available virtually. Thank you.
Just a brief follow-up, Esther. It's so great sort of to learn that actually this terrible pandemic has some positive impact in terms of creating innovation, creativity, online learning, and all these things that we have experienced over the last year. I'm just curious. You talked about innovations in the field of public health and science. And language acquisition. So were there differences in different academic disciplines? Did you see, some flourish, some you could sort of move into the virtual realm? and others it wasn't so easy? Do you have any experience on that?
Oh, well, thank you for that question. Indeed, additional analysis, of course, will have to be done as we build on the experiences. But I will note that there were some programs which already had an aspect of online learning and were able to build on those areas. I think that though, as I listen to what our members tell us, that areas of particular challenge were those that had important aspects which were done in person. So for example, we took chemistry. And we heard from many of our colleagues on those who are working directly in laboratory work. They had to, of course, they were often the people who still had to be on campus, because if you were running certain laboratory experiments, they needed to be monitored, and so they had to be in person on campus. And that some of that work was more difficult to transition into virtual space. People came up with different ways to do that, but we know that indeed that some disciplines may have had a greater challenge in this space than others.
All right, thank you so much. And going to you, Georg. So the Volkswagen Stiftung is the largest private research funding foundation in Germany, promotes the advancement of the science, including the humanities and social sciences, in research and higher education in Germany and internationally. So how, from your perspective, how disruptive was the pandemic? And, especially since the implementation of many of your programs probably wasn't possible during this time.
Yes, that's right. I joined the foundation 1.5 years ago, and I had about 2 months in office, which were more or less normal. And ever since then, we switched to an unusual mode of operation, which has become, to some extent, a new normal. And Esther, I should say, about 20 years ago, I had the privilege to lead the German American Fulbright Commission. And this was my first professional exchange with NAFSA, and ever since I continue to admire your organization, and it's a pleasure to meet you today and this morning. So thank you very much for having a chance to meet, and thanks to Stephen and Katja for providing this opportunity. So of course the pandemic, not only from a personal perspective, was disruptive, but what we saw in Germany, very similar to what Esther also reported, is that almost immediately there was a very intense and rapid interchange between the academic world, between scientists and scholars, and politics. And almost a new public debate started about the quality of this exchange and the intentionality of this exchange, leading to questions like, who is going to steer the country? Is it the scientists or the politicians? And of course, this juxtaposition is certainly misleading, because the general understanding of scientific advice to politics is that scientists do offer different options for action, but it's the political side that has to decide which options to choose and which action to take. However, it has become a very delicate relationship between the two realms, and it is a continuous debate now on how to further align this relationship. So this is very exciting to see. Disruptive on a different note was that, of course, international collaboration, not only in science and research, but also in politics, almost immediately was hampered. Germany, late last year, for half a year, had the presidency of the European Commission. And this presidency usually is used to bring people to Germany for conferences and ministerial councils. None of it happened. It was all digital, it was all online meetings. I had left the ministry almost a year before, and I was so sad not to be part of the German presidency. But when I saw what happened, I thought, okay, it's not that bad, because we all started to use, appreciate, and at the same time get tired of Zoom and WebEx and whatever else video conference technology that is used. And so modern technology, of course, provided new opportunities for exchanges, new restrictions. But I should also say offer new challenges, because we see, and this is my last point, Esther, we all deal with a younger generation that is on the one hand eager to go out and be exposed to other cultures and other cultural, political, societal environments. And at the same time, it is a generation that in a very different way uses new technologies. And on the one hand, I do see, just like you reported, universities trying to invent and reinvent the art of teaching and new modes of learning based on digital technologies and present and hybrid and online meetings. But at the same time, my feeling is that there is a younger generation that develops a new, almost cultural understanding of moving between different worlds, a virtual world, a world of personal encounters, and the lines between national and international started to blur. But the outcome is still not clear for me. My expectation is that there is a new generation that lives between these blurring lines and blurring boundaries, and develops a new understanding how to deal with it. And it's going to be very exciting to learn from this younger generation how to deal with it.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and we'll get back to this whole question of interconnectedness and new platforms, of new ways of communicating and passing on knowledge in a little bit. But I just want to come back, to what you said about who is steering the country. So, I think this is really the fascinating question when you observe sort of what has happened during the pandemic, and just we'll also dig a little bit deeper into that in a little bit. But I'm just wondering, just to set the stage, did you see any extra effort to collaborate between the public and private institutions? Was there any visible sort of sense that now it's a time to merge forces and to come up with solutions together? Georg, maybe you want to follow that up, and then I hand over to Steve to dig deeper into all these issues.
Well, in Germany and in the German science system, we do have public universities, and then we have a number of non-university based research institutions that work at least at arm's length from government, almost independently, at least self-administered. And there was an immediate and immense influx of funding into these organizations. First, to develop vaccines, of course. Here, there was research funding, and at the same time, the government itself provided funding to vaccine producers. BioNTech, in collaboration with Pfizer in the United States, BioNTech was funded in Germany. And for the first time, for decades at least, the German government bought shares of another company, CureVac, who unfortunately failed eventually to bring their vaccine to the market. But it was a huge and immediate effort in the middle of last year to develop, to produce, and to bring to the market the vaccines. And in a second wave, funding started to develop therapeutica for the pandemic in order to treat those affected by COVID. And the interplay with the private sector was that we, for example, as a private foundation, we carry the name Volkswagen because the Volkswagen company was founded during the Nazi dictatorship in Germany. And after the Second World War, it became a state-owned company. And it was privatized and stock listed in the early 1960s. And the revenues went into our foundation, and the revenues now are to be spent for the benefit of the public for science and research. And we saw it as our mandate to be a front runner, to be faster. So we started a therapeutic research program already last year. And we saw that there was a huge amount of public funding going into vaccine production. So we started to ask the question, how is the pandemic beyond or besides the challenge to on the medical side, how is it going to affect society? And how is the pandemic challenging well-established notions, almost concepts in various academic disciplines? And how is it challenging concepts of behavior in economics, in society at large? And so we started a program, a small grant program, and had a very open call for the more broader, to do research on the broader effects of the pandemic. And we were overwhelmed. And within 4 weeks, we received more than 1,000 proposals. And it became a huge challenge to process the proposals. But it's an indication for at least two things: the number of ideas which were out there, and the dynamics of the research system to react to the pandemic. So in short, a sort of interplay, only partially coordinated between public and private, a huge influx of public funding into the things that needed to be done immediately, and more leeway on the private side to then ask the more broader and further reaching questions.
Thank you for that. This is already such a rich conversation. And Esther, I've been watching you. You've been nodding from time to time as Georg was talking. Feel free to jump in at any point if there's something that you'd like to add. I'd actually like to take us in a slightly different direction, though. Georg was talking, of course, about the pandemic as a disruptor, but also as a catalyst. It's really caused a lot of people to take a step back and rethink things. Esther, that's a point that you touched on as well. But through all of this, this term knowledge diplomacy has come up over and over again. It's been regarded as a powerful tool that can sort of shape political realities. And I think that it has become even more important during this period of a pandemic. And yet it's somewhat elusive as a term or as a phrase. And so I thought maybe I could ask you, Esther, first, and then Georg, how would you define knowledge diplomacy? What does it mean to you and for your work?
Well, first, thank you for the question. I'll just take a moment and say I was nodding when Georg was speaking because I wanted to acknowledge particularly the role that the research universities have played, both in research, but also in distribution, that actually getting those marvelous vaccines into people's arms, and that in many communities that there's been challenge of dissemination for many, many reasons, but that universities and often university hospitals in many communities were able to get vaccines out quickly. And I want to say that network was an important role as well, that distribution element as well. So I just wanted to mention that. But indeed, the idea of knowledge diplomacy is a very, very exciting one. And if I to step back and say, first, I see knowledge diplomacy as part of the larger public diplomacy, which means reaching out to societies as a whole, not only out to, let's say, specific political leaders, but really engage as societies in working together on common problems. Then within a subset of that, looking particularly at the use of research and knowledge-based activities to build those relationships. And indeed, there's a long tradition of recognizing that learning together and teaching together can build and deepen relationships. Of course, as you've already I acknowledge, of course, the Fulbright program and its multiple decades of work in this area. Indeed, NAFSA was founded 2 years after the Fulbright-Hays Act was created, precisely because educators who were bringing international students realized they need to get together. So with decades of work in that area, I think are acknowledged. And of course, the outstanding role of Erasmus and Erasmus Plus for the larger community, even beyond Europe, that's playing in building those types of communities. So the knowledge diplomacy is crucial in really creating the networks of relationships that help us deal with the transnational issues that are so prevalent. And I think it's particularly important because the transnational issues are front and center of what we're grappling with. We're talking about public health. We could be talking about climate change. We could be talking about social justice. And I would say that one of the other areas where the education community has been on the front lines of helping society grapple with different challenge issues has been on social justice. That also, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement and how the education community approaches that, or how we think about social justice, that again, learning together has been part of it. I'll say, interesting enough, that amidst the pandemic, one of the books we already had on our queue of books to publish was actually a book on social justice and international education. It's our bestseller. It's the most popular book. We have a wide variety of things of which we're very, very proud, but that book has occasioned multiple conversations in very practical ways and on multiple levels. And so we realized that, again, that being able to share international experiences, it's an edited book with authors from many different places, that the education community is on the forefront of these great issues, and that knowledge diplomacy is something that we need to be part of that conversation. That said, combining that particularly with looking at the role of particularly science and research, again, I would say that we're again seeing important examples of knowledge diplomacy, whether it's the University of Georgia's work in Costa Rica. We look at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, for example, and their work with the Universidad de San Francisco de Quito in the Galapagos Islands, where they're looking at particularly sensitive area in the Galapagos Islands, and using that type of cooperation to address a particular example of climate change. So we're really seeing that it's the education community is at that forefront and that nexus that of where we're dealing with the transnational issues, but we need knowledge and sharing of knowledge to solve those types of issues.
Esther, thank you so much for pointing out how important some of these overarching challenges are that affect us all, regardless of where we live, and that almost underscores the reason or the rationale for why it's so important to work together to find solutions, to develop common approaches to meeting those challenges. But one quick question before I ask Georg for his definition of knowledge diplomacy and how it plays into his work. I find it really intriguing and fascinating to hear that the book that you mentioned about social justice and international education really being a bestseller right now. And I guess part of me wants to ask, do you think it would have resonated as well if it had been published a year and a half ago or 2 years ago? Do you think it's sort of a sign of the time that social justice issues and equity issues are front and center? And will it last? That's kind of the big question. Is it a blip, or is this really a sea change?
A very interesting question. I think that it would have been a very popular book, but there would have been somewhat different communities that were reading it. So, for example, that when we conceived of the book and looked at having an edited book, we were looking particularly in the higher education community and saying, particularly in the international education community, looking at thinking about social justice, thinking about what does diversity, equity, inclusion mean in the higher education space. I'll say at NAFSA that we've had discussions of diversity and inclusion have been in our strategic plan for quite some time. It's rewritten every couple of years for a word added equity. And so trying to understand what that meant and how that was something the education community would have been talking about and would have been talking about anyway. And looking at to what extent when we send American students abroad, how much do they actually know about our own history? Because that plays out even in how we interact when we're abroad. When we welcome international students here, and we find students who are also encountering the social and somewhat challenging social frameworks in the United States, and how are we as advisors to international students understanding enough about our own history that international students then interact with, so that we can prepare them for what they may face, especially for international students of color who arrive in the United States without challenged history. That was already an issue, and would have been a lively, important, serious discussion to which NAFSA wanted to contribute. But as I said, the larger society is also asking the same questions. So where the pandemic made a difference, I think, was that there were people outside the international education community who were looking for ways to think about some of these issues and were looked to the international education community. So it was the fact that it was beyond our immediate constituency that was interested in ways to discuss these issues.
And that's, I mean, I think that this increased awareness right now is so important. It's obviously something we're seeing domestically in the US. but it's been fascinating for me to see what sort of international waves have been created by this and how it's become a point that is addressed in other countries as well. So speaking of other countries, Georg, let me come back to you for a minute to ask you about how you would define knowledge diplomacy.
Well, I think I would like to follow up on Esther's historical perspective, because knowledge diplomacy is an indication of the differentiation of what happens in the diplomatic field. And of course, it's an indication of the importance of knowledge. What do I mean by that? We do see that traditionally diplomacy was about security issues and trade issues. And since the middle of the last century, we do see that there are other fields and other realms of knowledge that become important to diplomatic relations. Today, we talk about energy diplomacy, health diplomacy, and other issues. So we do see that other realms of knowledge become a dominant factor in international relations. And knowledge diplomacy is also an indication. I suppose about 10 years ago, we would have talked about science diplomacy. And it's an indication that, as you say, Esther, after the Second World War, with the Fulbright-Hays Act and other initiatives in other parts of the world, we do see that academic knowledge has been more widely distributed. We do see that in our societies, more and more people within their educational careers gather and build and continue to build academic scientific knowledge. So there is an increasing share of people who are exposed to take part in higher education, and they do play a role in society, also in international affairs. And my last point, scientific knowledge has become more and more important for the welfare of our societies. And so we see that scientific knowledge does play a role in diplomacy with regard to scientific advice to politics. We talked about that. Then there is, of course, diplomacy for science, diplomacy to advance scientific collaboration, because we do see that new knowledge depends on international collaboration. And then there is a science for diplomacy. We use scientific cooperation in order to advance diplomatic cooperation. For example, with regard to Germany, diplomatic relations between West Germany at that time and Israel were preceded by scientific collaboration between researchers from Germany and researchers from Israel. My last point, knowledge has become diverse today. And traditionally, we spoke about scientific collaboration, and our focus was on curiosity-driven basic research and the knowledge which is created in this field. A good friend of mine, an internationally minded dear friend of mine, Dale Medeiros of the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, Dale just recently alerted me to the fact that he said, just listen, we also have to focus on applied knowledge. And Esther, as you say, global challenges, for example, now the health challenge, but also the nexus between climate and health, which we currently experience in Germany with heavy floodings and disastrous results that we perceive here. We do see that these challenges also lead to new forms of collaboration and new forms of knowledge creation. And it's more applied knowledge triggered by joint work on global challenges. And it triggers new ways of exchanges, because this is knowledge that is not restricted to the academic realm, but it is applied in different parts of the society. So it is organizations like the Northern Virginia Regional Commission that then tries to build bridges, not only between universities, but also between cities and communities in the United States and Germany, in order to learn lessons and exchange knowledge between the two countries. So a new type of knowledge, a new quality of exchange as well.
You know, it's been so interesting to listen to the two of you, because I feel like you're complementing each other very, very well. And as both of you were talking about knowledge diplomacy, I was finding myself thinking, how much of the difficulty in understanding it is also a linguistic difficulty, because my world goes between Germany and the US. And the word Wissenschaft is sort of all-encompassing, right? It means science, but it also means knowledge on many levels. And so it's hard to really come up with a good definition. Esther, you were nodding very enthusiastically during Georg's comments there just now. Is there anything that you'd like to add to sort of complement what he was saying, or probably agree with what he was saying?
Well, thank you. I was just fascinated by the points you were making. I thought it was really interesting, but I must say I was having a reminiscence that we were talking about the importance of diplomacy and scientific cooperation, and I was thinking about some of the areas where we need to deepen that. And I was thinking about that earlier in my career. I had the honor of serving as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. That meant leading the United States policy in multilateral bodies, especially in the United Nations organizations, including the technical organizations. So all of the United Nations bodies, they were those were the overseas posts for my bureau. And one of the things that was fascinating, as someone who came out of the social science side of it, was precisely to see how our teams of diplomats and experts worked together. So if you walked into the United States mission to the United Nations agencies in Vienna, where is a home, for example, of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and you'd walk into the mission. If you looked on the wall, of course, you saw whoever the current president was, and you saw the secretary, but you saw the photograph of the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Energy, because it was important that both the diplomats and the experts on nuclear energy worked together. And so learning about that, whether it was World Health Organization, whether it was IAEA, whether it was at the United Nations Environment Program, to seeing scientists and diplomats working together, I thought was important. And one of the areas that, and some of the most interesting work I think these days includes how we bring together experts in the new spaces. So here we are enjoying our virtual space, but we know that there are great challenges about privacy and personal security in this space. What's the role of governments? What's the role of private entities? What are the responsibilities of private companies that support this fantastic technology? And how we think about the management of basically human development global spaces. We have talked about oceans and Antarctica, but we now have these virtual common spaces. Those are really interesting questions, and you need to have the political leaders who are supposed to embody the philosophy of our liberal democracies, and the technical leaders who actually know how these systems work. And that's really exciting work. And so I was nodding because I was thinking that yes, that interplay is so important for addressing the issues that face us today. Thank you.
But I completely agree, and I completely share the idealistic notion of international collaboration, because on a very personal note, as a former Fulbright student, I was exposed to it. I benefited from it for the rest of my life. But at the same time, having been involved and being involved in international scientific exchanges, we have to be aware that there is also a competitive notion. If we talk about the innovative power of new knowledge, how much do we want to share? How do we benefit? How do we want to be competitive to one's own advantage? So the issue of mutuality is, there is a conflict of interest between a mutual exchange on the one hand and individual advantage on the other. And then, of course, the second challenge, and it was either Katja or Stephen in the introductory remarks, which you mentioned, the second challenge is that we've come from a time in the second half of the 20th century where we had a division of our northern hemisphere, or almost the globe, along the Iron Curtain. And then we had the happy period of globalization, and we all thought it's going to be easy and the world is open and it's no longer a bipolar world, but probably also in academic terms, a multipolar world. And now I'm not sure where we are going, but it's going to be more complicated again. And so again, the idealistic notion of free exchanges is challenged by new divisions which we see, which are not induced by science and research, but induced by power politics. And soft power can only play a modest role here, I'm afraid.
Esther, do you want to jump in? Otherwise, I would.
Oh, definitely.
I would like to take this up, and your ideas about competition versus collaboration, the innovative power of science, but also, the question of evidence-based policies with new issues coming up, climate change, pandemics, all these issues, global issues that we're facing, where we definitely need science. But the question, I think, is, the responsibility of science and the interplay of science, politics, media, public. So what is happening? And Georg, you mentioned the complexity, and we don't know exactly where we're heading. So, when science dictates policies, where is the democratic process? How do you guarantee that all stakeholders are involved and that you don't have closed shop discussions and then policies at the end of it? And in Europe, we do observe a tendency towards autocratic, power plays. And of course, the whole question of, which system deals better with the pandemic, and, some people saying authoritarian regimes are better equipped sort of to cope with these health issues. All in this whole context, I'm curious what you think about, where is the responsibility of science, and how do you guarantee equal access to science and our democratic understanding? How can we save that and transport this into this new era of cooperation that we're talking about? Okay, enough talk. Esther, do you want to jump in?
Thank you, and I know Gary will want to comment on this as well. I wanted to pick up on a couple of different points, and then weave in what you just mentioned. One was just to pick up on the point of on imbalance, and one of the other trends within the international education community has been, before the pandemic will continue, has been trying to be more sensitive to the interactions, let's say, between universities in the Northern Hemisphere, wealthy institutions that may be partnering with institutions in the wider world, but need to be also thoughtful about the needs of, let's say, host partners, relative resources, and just the impact into who's making decisions, even if it's explicitly and implicitly. And so there's try to understand that better, and recognizing what should we be doing better in our professional practice to be able to try to mitigate some of the effects of those imbalances. So that's just to say that that's one area that the community is grappling with. The other is on evidence-based research. I would just maybe tie it together with one of the points from earlier in our conversation when we were talking about the next generation. The kids who are, my son's age, who's just finishing graduate school, and who are very comfortable in this virtual space, who may be more skeptical than my generation. In other words, that those of us who grew up in a world of paper were beginning the technology. I literally remember when I was a graduate student last year, taking my computer across the Atlantic and having to go register it with the Department of Treasury as an export that I was going to bring it back. And we're just talking, one of the 30-pound luggables, and I've moved on from that. But the fact that we grew up in a world where you watched maybe 3 network television stations and you read certain newspapers and you thought, okay, I think I know what truth is. And we recognize, one, we should always be skeptical, but also it may be this younger generation that actually is more skeptical about what they see on their phones, and maybe that we need to learn from them about this as well. But what evidence we trust. So I think that's just to link to that some of the generational issues that we're challenged. And finally, I wanted to acknowledge also that one is not Pollyannish about the role of research. Indeed, you know well the debate here in the United States about the interactions with China. major country research, important source of international students and scholars, but there is a bipartisan debate here, and which is occurring on multiple levels, and so there are many different aspects here that will be challenging. I do want to acknowledge that this is not a rosy view of preparation, and we recognize finally, going back to the impact of the pandemic, the dramatic drop in the number of international students able to appear physically. We've been able to do a lot virtually, but there are many students who are not able to access stable internet to be able to participate internationally, and we have to address those issues as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
The last point is of concern because, Esther, you mentioned the Erasmus program in Europe, and we do see that there are so many Erasmus students who simply cannot go to the other country because universities only teach online. And so the Erasmus experience is a stay-at-home, computer-based experience. And it's a pity because you need to be exposed, you need to be challenged to represent not only yourself, but your country, your culture. You need to be challenged to immerse into a different culture. And there is at least a cohort of students who is missing all that. And this certainly is a pity. With regard to China, I'm somewhat torn because if I look back to the 1980s, at that time when there was still an Iron Curtain in Europe, for example, under Polish martial law, there were quite a number of Polish scholars, especially in the legal field, who came to West Germany. And in the 1990s, these were the people who then rebuilt or build a new Polish legal system, for good or for bad, as we can see today, but at least in the 1990s, it was very promising. And so with regard to China, there must be people who have, on the Chinese side as well, who have an intrinsic desire to create new knowledge in collaboration. And at the same time, there is a layer of politics above all this that does not provide the freedom to the individuals to engage in these types of exchanges. And so if we cut the lines, we play it safe, but we at the same time miss opportunities for the future. And frankly, I do not have any idea how to solve this, but maybe we have to take a dual approach and dare to do something, even though there are costs and benefits to it.
So on these costs and benefits, I know, Esther, I mean, you stand for promoting international student exchange, and you want to make sure that all students, can have this experience. So of course, there's a problem with China, but there's also the divide between the global north and the global south. You already kind of alluded to that briefly before. How do you work towards this goal of really ensuring equal access and to make sure that knowledge, can be used in a good way, beneficial sort of to everybody? Also, is knowledge a public good, or is this something that's in the toolbox of each nation? So what's commodity knowledge, and how do you access that?
Oh, well, thank you for the question. I would say here in NAFSA, one of the joys of being here is being part of an organization that does have a mission. They actually go look at our values, which talk about trying to create a more inclusive engagement in international education. And so I would say that has very, very practical aspects. Now, as we respond maybe on two levels. On the larger level, and we were talking about, on the global level, about the importance of keeping open those lines of communication. So indeed, NAFSA very much is a strong supporter of welcoming international students into the United States, and making sure that they can get their visas. So one of the things we're working on now literally is encouraging the State Department, which is trying, but is also has the challenge of processing all of the visas for students to come back and our academic year starts in August. And so we're saying that we're glad that their consulate's opening up in China to process the students, because it's important that we reopen that line of students who are able to come to the United States. And so that's on the global level, just making sure that people can get here. But then also on the very practical level, saying how do we provide tools for the professionals in our field to actively be able to reach out to more students, especially with students from underrepresented groups who would not necessarily have the financial support to be able to be involved in education abroad. We think it's important, one, to provide expertise. Some of our publications and training do that. We actually created a new program called RISE, which is aimed particularly at international educational professionals who serve underrepresented groups and minority serving institutions, and particularly individuals themselves, because our field is certainly underrepresented, to help them be the advocates on their campus to bring in students who might not otherwise realize that international education is available to them. So we think that's part of very, very practically making sure that it is available to more students. But we see that it's both, as I say, on this global level, but then also on this very practical level of trying to make sure that we are making sure that everybody benefits from the wealth of what's available on a campus and becomes part of international education.
We are almost out of time. It is amazing how quickly this hour has passed. But I'm glad we're wrapping up by talking about the students, because as Katja and I talked a little bit about our conversation today, we wanted to end by looking at the future and looking at the next generation. And of course, this has been a thread throughout our conversation today. I found Georg's comments earlier very interesting about the blurred lines of the younger generation when it comes to being able to work in virtual environments and also in physical environments. Esther, I thought that your point was a very good one, that young people, the next generation, may be a little bit more skeptical about the information around them. I certainly hope that that's the case. I think media literacy is one of those points that we've not talked about, but that's so important when thinking about the next generation. And so that leads me to sort of ask each of you a closing question, which is, I think the pandemic and now, certainly climate change have really brought front and center that there will be more disruptive moments that we can't anticipate right now coming at us more quickly than they have in the past. And the question that I have is what sort of skills will the next generation of knowledge diplomats need to have in order to navigate that increasingly complex and volatile environment? What should be in their toolkit? How can we train them? And so maybe Esther, first to you and then to Georg, what are the skill sets? What are the needs that the next generation have in order to deal with the world around us?
Thank you so much for the question, because indeed we would argue very much that the skills that you have from international education, whether it's internationalization at home, but especially the opportunity to be outside one's own country, are crucial, because we think the skills that are needed are the ability to deal with uncertainty, the ability to evaluate a situation when you may have incomplete information or be unfamiliar with all the aspects. And one of the great things that people learn about being in an environment that is not their own is how to interact with people who are different, how to work with other colleagues, how to be able to come to a solution even though you may be working from different premises. Those skills can be acquired in many different ways. One of them is international education. We think is so important. And indeed, we see that both, I think we'd say that both philosophically, but also very practically. One of the other publications we brought out last year was a joint project between NAFSA and an organization called EMSI. And they are a recruiting organization. We were able to analyze millions of job postings. And what we saw was that the positions for managers, for more senior jobs, required the ability to have critical thinking, to make choices, be decision makers. And those things are the skills often decisions often have to be made. We have incomplete information. So the types of skills that will be needed in these complex workforces of the future are the types of skills that come from these types of interactions, international interactions in the education space. So we think that those skills, dealing with ambiguity, working with others, will be crucial as we move forward into the future.
Can you indulge me? Can I push you on that just a little bit more? Because I personally couldn't agree with you more that the ability to navigate a foreign environment is incredibly important for now and for the future. And in one of my previous jobs where I worked with a lot of high school students and was trying to get them to push back their blinders and see the rest of the world, I found myself often saying that the global environment is multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and it's here now. It's not something that's coming. And some people would push back on that to me and dismiss that as being, those are soft skills. Those are not the kinds of things that young people need to adapt to. Do you hear the argument that dealing with ambiguity, dealing with uncertainty is a soft skill? And how do you respond to that?
Indeed. Well, one of the reasons that we undertook this study and other work we've done on workforce development was try to pin that down. So just to say that for that particular report, which was called Developing a Globally Competitive Workforce Through Study Abroad, the Value of Study Abroad Skills in the United States Job Market, which came out in 2019, you can go to our website and see what it is, that we did analyze hundreds of millions, I said millions, it was actually hundreds of millions of job entries. And just in that survey, 31 million job openings required skills that students acquire from study abroad. And we found that employers spend more time looking for people with these skills, that the employers and job seekers recognize that these were needed for management levels, and for jobs, certainly for the senior most levels, they were all skills that were required. So we were able to document more and more that, right, indeed, many people recognize that you want to be able to show that students get that first job out the door when they complete their education. But we are finding that it's certainly true for the next job and the job beyond that, and for your career, that these skills are particularly important. And so we find we also have to make that point, and we use these types of studies to try to do so.
Thank you, Esther. Thanks very much. So Georg, when you think about the next generation of future diplomats, what sort of skills should they have, and what should be in their toolkit?
Well, I couldn't agree more with Esther and with you, Steve, on this last exchange. If I may add two remarks. One is that earlier this morning, I had a debate about how to deal with future crises, the ones we do not know. And shortly after the pandemic, or at least almost in the middle of the pandemic, we had floods in Germany, heavy rainfall and floods of an unforeseen height, never experienced before. And I'm afraid that the next challenges again will be different. It might be a complete breakdown of public services due to a cyber attack. We saw minor examples on the American East Coast, in hospitals, in universities. What if a country as a whole and the electricity supply, the water supply breaks down for 2 weeks? We have to be able to deal with it. And how can we be prepared for it? And one of the answers I got was, what is the best place to think about it? Or is there any better place than academia? This is what science is about, to also think about the future, about potentialities, about what might happen. So if I may add one thing, then it is the ability to understand and perform science and research, no matter what the specialization is. But living in a world that so heavily depends on advanced knowledge, on scientific knowledge, we do need people with a proper skill set to navigate in this world. So in addition to be able to deal with the unforeseen, at the same time, it's expertise and general knowledge about science and research. And my second remark brings me back almost to my initial remark. On the one hand, we try to extrapolate what the next generation of people, of future leaders, of those who are responsible, what kind of skills they need. And at the same time, they develop their own skill set, if I may say so. On a very personal note, my daughter, age 22, studies in the Netherlands, has an Erasmus fellowship now for Spain, does not know whether she will be able to study in Spain, but she told us last night, I'm going to go there anyway, because if it is remote studying back home in the Netherlands, I can do it from Spain. But I'm not going to fly, I take a train, because it's for environmental reasons, I no longer want to fly. And there is so much in this decision from which we can learn that I continue to be amazed by the younger generation. So it's a wonderful learning experience for us as well.
Esther and Georg, thank you so much. Georg, I think this was a perfect closing remark. And I would just love to take up this conversation like in another 5 years and to see, you know, where we're gonna head and you know what the world looks like. But I think one thing is for sure, you know, the role of science academia is increasing, and you know the need to educate people and to equip them with the right skill sets and to ensure a just and equitable distribution of this knowledge is also increasing. So thank you both for this incredibly valuable and insightful conversation. Georg and Esther, and also thanks again for the German Center for Research and Innovation for partnering with us for this event. So thank you, and hopefully see you again in person at some time soon.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be part of this group. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to be with you. Thank you.